The split between humans and chimpanzees, we think from the molecular biology, was around 5 to 7 million years ago, which is very recent on an evolutionary timescale. And humans and chimpanzees are so closely related, for instance, that if you examine the proteins that are the same, from the same gene, you often cannot find any differences in the subunits of those proteins.
Rebecca Cann was on the team at the University of California at Berkeley that found clues to our past, deep in our cells. They studied the genetic code from people all over the world.
What we're really looking at is a process called lineage coalescence. When you did that, they all coalesced into a single ancestor, a maternal ancestor.
They calculated human lineage back some 200,000 years to a theoretical ancestor the press promptly dubbed Eve.
I actually don't like to use the word Eve because it has a lot of religious connotations that aren't really biologically accurate. It implies that there was a single ancestor for all people, and this is sometimes seen in the press as a single woman who gave rise to all humans. That's not really true. There could have been anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000.
If the Berkeley team's research holds, then everyone in the world, all the individuals and families and tribes and races, can trace their family tree back to a small band of people who lived in Africa 200,000 years ago. If anything had happened to that tiny group, famine, flood, disease, anything, the human race might not exist.
There has to have been several billion years of continuous, successful parent-to-offspring transmission to get to us. At any one point, if that had not been successful, our line of ancestry would have died.
In the northern hemisphere, horses evolved to fill a herbivore's niche in the ecosystem. On the isolated continent of Australia, nature took a different tack. Instead of horses, evolution came up with kangaroos. If we ran evolution again,
there is a very strong chance element in exactly the way evolution goes. So, for example, I'd be fairly happy in predicting that we would get eyes, seeing organs, because eyes have indeed evolved about 9 times independently in different parts of the animal kingdom, and the same sorts of eyes have evolved several times independently. I'd be pretty confident that you would get animals that we'd call carnivores, animals that we'd call herbivores, animals that we'd call parasites, and so on. And they would do their carnivory, their herbivory, and their parasitism in roughly the same ways, but they wouldn't be exactly the same.
It might not even finish up with an intelligent, communicating, talking animal. I mean, it's very striking that the dinosaurs ruled the Earth for 100 million years. They ran about on their hind legs, so their hands were free. There's nothing to stop them making tools. And yet they never invented or evolved an intelligent, speaking form.
Try to imagine what the Earth's dominant species would have looked like if dinosaurs had evolved instead of mammals. Paleobiologist Dale Russell of the Canadian Museum of Nature did that. And the result was a winsome green creature who probably would have been sure that it too was the inevitable outcome of biological history. Karl Marx, Andrew Carnegie, Joseph Stalin, John D. Rockefeller, Adolf Hitler. What do these men have in common? From capitalists to communists, all found in a misinterpretation of Darwin, justification for the conduct of their lives. They seized on a phrase Darwin never used, survival of the fittest, and used it to rationalize attitudes and actions that affected the course of modern history.
In the late 19th century, there was a whole school of thought, or perhaps several schools of thought, which now are known as social Darwinism, which really used evolution as an underwriting of a fairly crude kind of competitive ethic in society, what we might call a free market ethic, but more than that, the notion of dog eat dog, the weakest to the wall, and the phrase that Darwin's contemporary Herbert Spencer actually used for natural selection, which was survival of the fittest.
But Spencer thought evolution had a direction, from simple to complex, from inferior to superior. Darwin's version of the theory was not survival of the fittest. It could be better paraphrased as survival of those best adapted.
Well, the master race idea, from which we think of in connection with the 30s and with Germany, in some senses was the low point in the whole attempt to apply evolutionary and biological thinking to human affairs, because that's to turn a scientific theory into a moral statement or even a political statement, which of course it is not.
The Nazis taught that Jews were evolutionary throwbacks. The Aryan race, they said, was the pinnacle of evolution, and maintaining racial purity was an evolutionary obligation.
Well, it wasn't just Hitler who thought about the idea of applying biological ideas in a rather radical way to human affairs. Eugenics as an idea, the idea that we should somehow apply principles to make us evolve into a superior species. Those ideas had been commonplace in the United States, in North America, and across Europe for 25 years before Hitler came to power.
In Darwin's time, too, there were those, most typically among the gentry, who claimed that evolution justified their lives. They said money given to the poor was merely aiding the unfit, allowing them to increase their numbers and delay evolutionary progress. The argument is not unknown today. Darwin was clearly uncomfortable using words like evolve and evolution because the words contained the notion of going from a lesser state to something better. As Darwin defined natural selection, it had no particular direction. Descent with modification doesn't have a goal. It just is.
We have no automatic right to our place on the earth. We have no automatic guarantee of our long-term survival. Most species that have ever lived are now extinct. Evolution is about change, and we suddenly realize how fragile any given or single species' life is, including our own. And I think that general moral, that there is something about our place within the living world and our responsibility as a moral and an intelligent species, perhaps to try to conserve, to nourish that living world and not simply to do with it what we will for short-term gain, that may be, in the long run, perhaps the single most significant moral insight that we get from the idea of evolution.
Such insights are a direct result of the studies of a reclusive beetle collector with a passion for facts. We will need such moral insights if we eventually use the genetic tools that modern science is developing.
And I'm pretty sure that if we survive, if we do not destroy ourselves by pollution and atomic war and so on, we will sooner or later wish to take control of our own evolution. But I hope we do not do it too soon. I mean, I think at the moment we are far too ignorant, both of genetics and of what we really want, to tinker with our own evolution. So I'm not urging eugenic measures upon us. I'm really not. I hope we will not do that. But ultimately, I'm sure we will. What we shall decide we want, of course, is up to our great-great-great-grandchildren, but they will take this on.
Charles Darwin lived in Down House until he died in 1882. He continued walking, thinking, writing papers and books. He finally tackled the touchy subject of human evolution in a book called The Descent of Man. But none of his later works would match the impact of Origin of Species. In a very real sense, that book gave us the world.
There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one. From so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved.